Well, welcome everybody to this webinar. My name's Roddy Gow. I'm the founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, and we are absolutely delighted and honoured to have Michael Goedhuis, my good friend, and a terrific expert on Asian art, amongst other things, to talk to us today. Um, Michael himself started as an economist with degrees at the Courtauld and elsewhere, and then after a career in investment banking, gradually moved to the world of art, where he worked on the Rothschild collection, amongst other things, during the time that he was with Jacob Rothschild. But he's agreed today to talk with us about the influence of art in China and the importance which we at the Institute attach considerable influence on of understanding the cultures and the arts of particular countries so as to better comprehend what their direction is and what their aspirations are. And what we're going to do today is that Michael is going to very kindly talk for 10, 15, 20 minutes or so, which will give me then a chance to ask him some questions and open up the field, if you like, to those who are watching this webinar. And you can please post your questions in the chat function that you will find at the bottom of the screen. So, Michael, I can't thank you enough for talking to us today. It's your afternoon, my morning here in America, and we look forward so much to hearing what you kindly have to say.
Roddy, thank you so much, and thank you for your very nice introduction, and enabled me to remember my long past. And it's very nice to be here, and very nice to not see you all, but to be able to talk to you all for a few minutes. And I think the first thing I should say is that the title of this webinar, which I created myself for you, Roddy, is a little bit ambitious. And I think it was a little bit sort of, I overplayed my hand slightly. What I really want to say is that I think that the possibilities of understanding China today can be achieved through, to some extent, through an experience of Chinese contemporary culture today. And it may not be necessary to learn Chinese or to be conversant with the whole of Chinese history to have some understanding of what of the psychology of the Chinese today. And you know, I've been going around the world since 1991, which is when I first went to mainland China to try to get in touch with artists. Since then, I became so bullish about China, so confident about the Chinese future, and felt so comfortable with the new self-confidence of the Chinese, in particular the artists at that time, that I went around the world for a long time saying, China is the dominant reality for the rest of history. And I've been saying it for a long time. And about 2 months ago, I got a text from a historian of Chinese history in one of the Ivy League colleges, saying that he had followed my trajectory, my videos and my publications for some years, and he'd even visited me at an exhibition in New York, but that he took issue with my rather flamboyant description of China. China is the dominant reality for the rest of history. And he said, what do you mean by saying that? And I said, you know, what I mean is that China is clearly the superpower, technological and scientific superpower today, or growing to be that. It does produce more electric cars than anybody else in the world. It is the leader in quantum computing today. It is in artificial intelligence supreme in certain areas of artificial intelligence. It does have the biggest aerospace exploration industry in the world. It has the best high-speed railway in the world. And the green technology, the renewable technology, is also supreme in China compared to everybody else. And this is a big deal. In in addition to which, it's the only empire that's, as you know, that has ever come back into the world stage. It never happened with Mesopotamia or Egypt or Greece or Rome or Byzantium, or the Ottoman Empire or the British Empire. None of these great empires have ever come back onto the world stage. China has big time. And this is why I think China is going to be so important for us all in the world to understand and to cope with for the rest of history. And he came back and said, yes, I take all your points. They're well understood and very obvious. But I still think that I think he called it exuberant hyperbole should be refined somewhat. So I'm not saying it anymore, Roddy, and I'm just keeping to a more sober assessment of what I think the future of China is. But meantime, in this world that we're in, and especially now that Trump is in charge of America, I think that it's really important to rectify the shortfall in many of the foreign offices in the West, including the State Department and the Foreign Office in England, in terms of understanding the motivation of China and putting it in the context of Chinese history. This is the longest history of any empire, of any society. And I think we should be reading not just the lines, but between the lines of what China is doing and saying. And this is not happening effectively, I don't think, as we see, between China and the US, and even from many of the other Western foreign policymakers. So this is my theme, if you like, that I think that for the next generation, if not for this one, we want to try to avoid, what I think of as a dialogue des sourds, a dialogue of deaf people who are not really meeting each other. And it's obvious to me that why it's difficult, because if you look at our civilization, starting with Greece and Rome and the classical world and Saint Augustine, and then Locke and Goethe and Descartes and the Enlightenment and all of that, and you compare it with what has been, in effect, China's philosophy and history, which is Confucius, the dominant one, Buddhism and Taoism, it's so very different. And we've evolved so fast through our different philosophical stages, and they haven't, despite their deep cultivation and scholarship and so forth. So I felt or feel that one way of getting access to the Chinese mind is through what is happening today in China. And what is happening is, and has been happening since the early 1980s, is the emergence of a cultural revolution. At the end of that political cultural revolution, there has really become a cultural revolution in China. And it's happening in all sorts of areas. It's happening in music, it's happening in dance, it's happening in philosophy, it's happening in film, it's happening in photography, and it's happening in philosophy, it's happening in art. And it's very dynamic. And this has been going on now since the 80s, 90s, and the first part of this century. And it's really been extremely adventurous, I think, Chinese contemporary culture, more than any other, more than what's happening in any other culture. And so I feel that if one can somehow find a way to look into it and experience it, either through looking at paintings or listening to the poetry or whatever it may be, I think it is one route into the Chinese psyche. And so I'm going to just canter through some of the images that we can show you of paintings that were started to be made just after the Cultural Revolution ended in China, and we'll be able to see, what was going on and what's going on today. And so, Eilish, if you can get an image up, right. So the relevance of Chinese contemporary art, as I say, that title was a little exaggerated, but anyway, I think you've all got the point now. This image, by the way, here is just of a recent exhibition we did in an art fair in London, and our accent there was on a different theme, but I'll just mention it. It's because it's very interesting that we are tracing the evolution of Western modernism right back to Chinese designs of the third century AD, BC, I mean, and these designs were taken up by the literati in the 11th and 12th century, the Song period in China, and then moved on to Japan, etc. And what was coming into Europe in the 19th century via Japan and taken up by the Impressionists and others in Paris, particularly, all those artifacts and works of art and paintings and Japanese prints and so on had a huge effect on, as we know, on our Nouveau and then on Art Deco. So I was trying to trace a link in this exhibition between Chinese archaeological material and European modernism. But let's go to the first image here. And in the 1980s and 90s, Ai Weiwei started to become prominent. And this particular photograph is of him dropping a Han Dynasty, 2nd century BC urn. And what he's saying here is, and as most of you must know, he's very controversial for the Chinese and very conceptual in his art in general and very brave. But what he's saying here at this very early stage is that the Han civilization needs to be dropped. We need to move on from our history and embrace the modern world on the one hand, but at the same time, he's saying that that civilization, or hinting that that civilization is precious and has to be in some way retained in our new world and in our new Chinese society. So that's Ai Weiwei, and I won't dwell on him because he's done so much since then and so many interesting installations and so forth. But he is a key figure in the evolution of Chinese contemporary culture. And now we have Liu Shadong, who is a great painter in China. And here you see the sort of paintings that were being done in the 1980s and 90s and early part of this century by the Chinese artists who now felt, after Mao, free to espouse Western themes, Western art, and they wanted to be cool. And this is a portrait of two. He had the series called the Prostitute Series, and this is a sort of genre scene of these two prostitutes in their bedroom. And the idea here was that with the technical ability that those artists then had coming out of the Mao era in the 1960s and 70s and learning to paint what was basically the Russian social realistic style. In other words, they learned how to paint Western style very, very well. They started to adopt themes which they felt were cool, were Western, were a bit subversive, etc. And interestingly enough, and we can move to the next one, interestingly enough, the Western market thought that these artists were being very brave in defying communist rule at the time and incorporating sort of hints of criticism of the government and doing things which, like in this painting, he calls Sunday brunch, but this is really an example of eroticism run wild in a sort of 14th century, 15th century Flemish style, so brilliantly painted. But here again, defying, as we Westerners understood it at the time, the communist regime. And these paintings, and we'll see the next one as well, became very fashionable in the West in the 1990s. And Chinese art and culture became very, very fashionable. And here again, you see Cigarettes and Alcohol by Hussein, a painting of, what was going on in China: cool nightclubs, cigarettes, alcohol, a Western lifestyle enjoyed by the young, and who felt free and free to do what they liked. And in fact, there was very little censorship in those days. There was hardly any censorship. I mean, one could do all this type of painting. One couldn't directly oppose the government. One could do all this. So it was very exciting time. And the rather gullible Western collectors gulped this down, gulped down these paintings, which eventually became very, very expensive. And I'm now talking about the early part of this century. And then we move on because things change. Well, this artist also, Liu Qinghe, this is a touching example of an artist who was very aware of the social implications of the industrialization in China. And here is a portrait of Li Ming, who was one of the girls, of the hundreds of thousands of girls coming into the big metropolitan areas in China from the countryside. And their destiny was a pretty abused one and a rather sad one. And here is I think, a beautiful portrait of one of these young girls, often teenage girls, who made their way to Shanghai and Beijing, etc. So a social consciousness begins to emerge. And here, Xu Ping, who is without any doubt one of the very, very most important artists of his generation, Chinese artists, who was spent many years in New York, and is, I suppose one could label him a conceptual artist. But here is an example of the enduring fascination by the Chinese for Chinese calligraphy. It is the foundation stone of Chinese civilization, Chinese calligraphy. And here he calls this a spring dawn, which is a poem by a famous poet, classical poet. And here Xu Ping is writing the calligraphy in what looks like Chinese characters. And when Chinese come to look at this from afar, they will think, oh my goodness, this is Chinese. And then they come close to it and they try to read it, and they discover that they cannot read it because it's English. And English people approach it and say, oh gosh, what beautiful Chinese calligraphy. And indeed it is. But we can't read it. What a pity. But in fact, they can read it. Because if you look carefully at each character, and if you're relatively imaginative, which is not my case, but haven't read all of them, they are actually in English. You can see "the" on many times. You can see Meng Heron, the artist, on the right-hand panel. You can see the Tang Dynasty. I can't point at it here, and it's all in English. And I think what Xu Ping is saying here, amongst many things, is that is this dialogue des sourds. The Chinese can't read it because it's English, and the English can't read it because they can't decipher it. And so it's some sort of indication of the difficulties of breaking linguistic and social and psychological boundaries. So that's one great theme of his. He has others, and the importance of language being one of them. But we'll move on to another very famous artist in China, Gu Wenda. And this is actually a beautiful, rather small work of calligraphy, and he started painting wonderful images, calligraphic images in the 1980s, again, rooted in scholarship and understanding of the classical canon of the civilization of China, but starting to feel that he had to liberate a calligraphy which was holding the country back, holding back society, and liberate it and make calligraphy more pertinent and meaningful to a new generation, a new society in China. So he's distorting the figures, distorting the characters, and one may actually be able to decipher one or two of these characters, but with much difficulty. And he went on developing this theme and in huge monumental calligraphic works and many installation works as well, with themes of the richness of Chinese culture and its impact on the West in the modern world, and vice versa. And here is another famous artist, Chen Feng, who, and it's again, in my view, a beautiful painting, now fully abstract, no attempt really to capture any sort of realistic meaning. West Wind, East Water is the title, and maybe there is something, you could discern something of that in it, but it's basically an abstract painting. And what he's done here, Chen Feng, is soaked the background paper, which he makes himself, in coffee and tea. He soaks it in tea, in coffee, and then tea, and the idea, and then creates this rather beautiful, modulated, subtle background. And here he's saying that, and he spent a lot of time in Berlin, in sort of avant-garde world of Berlin, and so he became very aware of Western art. And here he's saying the East is represented by the soaking of the tea, and the West is represented by the soaking of the coffee. And this abstract painting refers right back to Chinese calligraphy, going right back thousands of years on the one hand, but at the same time, it's capturing Western modernism, in other words, American abstract expressionist painting. And this again is a wonderful work by Wang Dongling. Wang Dongling was a teacher at Hangzhou University, Hangzhou, south of Shanghai, beautiful old town, still a beautiful town. And interestingly enough, the academy, the art academy there, which is where he teaches, is both the most innovative, technical, artistic academy in China, doing very, very innovative things with video and so forth on the one hand, but at the same time, it's also the most well-known academy for the development of Chinese ink painting, classical Chinese ink painting, and its modern variation. And here you have an example by this terrific artist, now in his middle 80s, of what is really, again, a purely abstract painting. He himself is a classical calligrapher of note, and he's gone completely abstract. And it's a very beautiful, and of course it brings to mind a Western contemporary, Western modern painting like by Franz Klein and so forth, but it's Chinese. And this is dwelling a little bit on the calligraphers, because that really is what is the area where so much innovative work is being done. This is by Wei Li Gang, who was a physicist and mathematician, and then became interested in doing classical Chinese calligraphy, and then began to feel 30 years ago or so that you had to, classical Chinese classical calligraphy was no more meaningful to so many people in the new society. So he started tampering with calligraphy. And here's some years later, what has happened with him is that he's taken each character, taken Chinese characters, completely distorted them and making them into these sort of colorful roundels, and tried to evoke the meaning of the painting, which is called peacock or Wreath's peacock, through representational means. In other words, you can, with a bit of imagination, you can see the tail of the peacock through these roundels. And of course, he's now introduced color, which was not permitted in thousands of years of Chinese painting. Color was not something that was allowed. And here, this is another example of his work where he's completely freed up the calligraphic line. And it brings to mind that in the 8th century in China, the Tang period, some Chinese painting was made by Chinese artists who were completely abstract. And they were dripping and doing what sort of thing that Pollock was doing in 1950s then. And here, Wei Ligang is saying, look, I'm retrieving that past. I'm letting free the calligraphic line. There's no attempt at defining a character or defining any sort of meaning in terms of representation. I'm just letting it flow. And he's put this very, very long title, which is almost ironic because who can possibly decide to see anything of that title in this work? Zhou Dishu's just died 3 years ago and was also a great artist in China, an ink artist. And these ink artists became the authority on Chinese contemporary culture in America, teaching at Stanford, has said that the ink artists in China, those artists using ink and brush on Chinese paper, are the most idealistic and intellectually adventurous of any of the artists in China. And this is one of them. And Zhou Dishu was the offspring of academics in China. And they were murdered in front of him by the Red Guards. And he then, this was in 1975 or 4, he then became a Red Guard and did terrible things as a Red Guard in China during the Cultural Revolution to other people. And when the Cultural Revolution came to an end, he had a terrible breakdown and emerged in 1979, 1980, and started painting ink paintings. And he'd been a propaganda artist while he was a Red Guard, doing big propaganda works on walls. And he created the first avant-garde group in China. It was called Grass, and therefore became very famous. And it was these artists were working in all sorts of mediums. And he was working Chinese ink on Chinese paper. And this is a very large and good example of his work, in which these Chinese contemporary artists were looking back to the classical canon, were studying the old masters, just like Picasso and Cézanne and Braque and Kandinsky studied the old masters in European history, like Poussin and Raphael and Velasquez and Rembrandt, in order to be able to make their new revolution, which was Cubism and abstraction in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And the Chinese ink artists are doing the same. They're studying the old masters of the Sung period, the 11th, 12th century, the subsequent period, the Ming period, studying the old masters, these great paintings, many of which are now in Taiwan, and trying to create a new pictorial language out of the past. And it was only possible for Picasso and Cézanne, etc., to make a brand new language, to create a revolution in art, because they'd understood the whole lineage of European art history. And he, of course, he's referring back to the landscape tradition, where this is a mountainscape. And so he's going back to that, but he's introducing all sorts of elements. He's using not just ink, but oil, and doing collage, and the whole thing is very complicated. But it's a new world that he's created.
Yeah. Quite beautiful, yes.
And then lastly, there are a couple here of Chinese ink paintings. Li Huayi is one of the 2 or 3 most famous ink painters, working in a classical style, but injecting with, again, via deep scholarship of the past, but injecting certain modernist elements which make it impossible to confuse this with a Sung period painting, although superficially it looks rather similar, but beautiful technique, brush technique, and very poetic and very beautiful, but contemporary. And the same goes for the Liu Dan, who is possibly the most famous of all the Chinese ink painters at the moment, who's here painted this tree of old cypress tree from the Forbidden City, which still exists. And again, deep understanding, deep scholarship of the Chinese civilization on the one hand, and then this very fresh new way of actually applying the brush painting, the brush to with ink onto the paper. And this is another beautiful painting by him of a peony, but something which could not ever be confused with something done 9 centuries ago. So very contemporary in one way, but rooted in the past. And then finally, you've got Yang Yangping, who was the first artist that I represented, and she became very well known in 1980 and 81 because she was well known in China, and she was a woman, and the directors of museums and curators in the West, she was one of the first artists they ever went to see in China. And in fact, she became very famous because of that. And she came out of China in 1986 and had a big career after that. Many Western museums have bought her work, and partly because of this history. And of course, she's a woman, so that works very well today. And she's, again, an ink painter, introducing much more color. She's a famous colorist. And she's taken as a major theme the lotus flower, which for her symbolizes the fact that it grows into the dung, the mud of humankind and of the Chinese horrific situation under Mao for all those years. But it grows up, and it grows up through the water, and it ends up at the top of the lake or the pond, pristine clear, which is where she hopes that China will eventually evolve to. And I think that's the end of all my images, Roddy.
Well, Michael, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. And just to re-emphasize what I said at the beginning, which is that any and all of us who are interested in the century of Asia, do naturally incline towards trying to gain an understanding of the art of China. And I wonder if, just to get us going, I could ask you, are there other art dealers who are interested in these aspects of Chinese art as you are? And if so, how many?
Yes, I mean, I think that what's happened is that this market became very hot, as I was saying, very fashionable.
Yeah.
25 years ago. And that it has now subsided big time. And the fashion has gone elsewhere to African art, to LGBT art, and all sorts of other areas. And so it's become much less fashionable. And many of the dealers dealing in it then have now evaporated. However, there's a very good dealer in China who is dealing in this area. And there's also one or two in Hong Kong, the one or two in Paris and New York. So there are still good dealers in the area, but not so many as there were. In other words, the fashion has subsided. What I believe, however, is that our clientele, which used to be the top collectors in the world for many years, were European, Belgian, and Swiss. Those were the top collectors in Chinese contemporary art, well ahead of the Chinese or the Chinese of the diaspora or the Americans or the English. And then it moved to, the market basically moved mostly to America, where we had some very, very good collectors. Then it moved on to Chinese in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, intellectual, educated Chinese who became very interested in Chinese contemporary art, both the sort of social realist type, but also the ink paintings and the avant-garde. So that's what's happened. And I think that I'm giving you rather an ample answer to your question, but I think is happening now that the younger generation in China are beginning to become interested in their own culture. And rather like the young generation in the West, they like to buy contemporary things, not old things. And this is a means to collect things which are related to their past, to their huge past.
And I suppose, Michael, that would lead me on to the asking if any of your collectors today are actually involved in making policy in the West, whether there's a link
Right. Well,
between
this
the
is so
two.
interesting. I wish they were, because I think that would give them some sort of an access. I don't want to overdo it, but it's some sort of an access to what's going on in China and the mindset of China, in the society of China. I don't speak Chinese or very little, and so I don't. I feel that unless one speaks Chinese, one can't really get a complete hold of Chinese psychology. But I think one can do, nevertheless, a lot, and by reading and by understanding Chinese culture and history, etc., and by understanding what's going on today in China. So I think it's possible. But unfortunately, I don't have real policymakers as clients. I do have some quite intelligent people, but so far they're not. Unfortunately, they're not in politics. Rather sad.
Yeah. And Chinese artists themselves, are they particularly interested in attracting Western interest?
Well, right, exactly. They were very
But
interested.
are they still or not, you don't
Yes,
think?
well, um, they certainly were when it was fashionable, and they were making a lot of money out of it. Now, I think they're much less interested because they actually have a market, a local market, which is snapping up their work. So they don't really depend anymore. In the olden days, 20 or 30 years ago, they needed a Western audience and they were feeding it. But I think now there's enough of a demand in China, mainland China itself, for them to be uh, perfectly happy with that. And in fact, it's quite difficult for us to get the very best paintings from them now because they feel that they can sell them there. And the only way I can really get works from those Chinese artists today is by trying to persuade them that this is the way to get into Western museums, and that they still are interested in.
And I assume a number of Chinese artists have moved outside China and are practicing energetically in the countries that they now live in.
Yes, actually, funnily enough, I think it's happened much less now. They were doing that. Xu Ping, Liu Dan, all those famous artists did move out of China in the 1980s and 90s, etc. And they were in New York and Paris, and they developed, and Berlin, and they did develop a lot aesthetically because of that. But I think now, when I'm looking at our clientele of artists, most of them are now in China and not moving. Yeah.
We have a question from John Delft, I think it is. What do we know about Chinese interest in art from other cultures? Have they been absorbing those? You made reference to the classical artists and their influence, but what evidence is there of them absorbing current modern cultures from the West?
Right. If I understood the question correctly, it's a very good one. Is there much interest in Chinese art from other countries in Asia? And I think that the answer to that is not much that I am aware of. I think in general, the demand for Chinese culture, Chinese contemporary culture, does come from the Chinese. And as I was saying earlier, it comes mostly now for us from Hong Kong Chinese, Singaporean Chinese, and Taiwan Chinese, rather educated Chinese who are buying Chinese contemporary art and are deeply interested in it.
And are there other artists that you know of in Taiwan itself?
Yes, so yes, there are very good artists in Taiwan that we also represent, and it's interesting. It's a slightly, and we haven't actually done any images of this, unfortunately, of any of them, but very interesting, somewhat different, maybe in a very oblique way, influenced by the Japanese occupation of Taiwan um, during the war, and and a slightly different orientation to the Chinese in mainland China. Yeah, it's very interesting and but very good. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, okay. And what about the attitude of the Chinese government? Of course, they've had an enormous explosion of economic activity since joining the World Trade Organization. That's made a huge difference to their growth. But do they adopt a policy of tolerating some of this more progressive art?
Right. So
Um,
exactly. So in the 1980s,
yeah,
it was the government was very relaxed. And unless one was particularly provocative, they would let artists do more or less what they wanted, which is what we saw in the early images of this talk. But now, Xi Jinping in the last few years has clamped down very aggressively on luxury in general, on
I see.
corruption, on money making, and so on. And the art market is reeling from this. The artist villages have been destroyed, and there's much more censorship, and it's much, much harder for them. And the art market in China has really become subdued because of governmental policies.
Right, right. I'm just reading something here from, I think it's Runji to everyone. The real objects, that's paintings, sculptures, jewelry, are exceptionally of our interest in Shanghai from foreign cultures such as Roman Empire or ancient Greek. Now, not quite sure. Oh, and the UK. Not entirely sure what that question, if you understood that.
I,
So,
I didn't, but I often don't understand things very well, so don't worry about it. If you could possibly repeat it, I'll try to figure out.
well, it says the real objects, paintings, sculptures, jewelry, etc., are exceptionally interesting to us in Shanghai. But these are objects from foreign cultures, such as the Roman Empire or ancient Greek. So these are classical
Right.
objects of
So,
classical art. So
uh,
the suggestion there is that in Shanghai, in mainland China, there is an interest in classical objects and art from the West.
yeah,
Would you
well,
agree with that?
that's very interesting, and I can well believe that that is the case. It does bring me to an interesting point, however, that the reason why some of the young in China are buying Chinese contemporary art rather than Chinese archaeological material or early 17th or 16th or 12th century art is because there is a massive problem of fakes in
Yeah.
China. They are magnificently good at faking jade and painting and pottery. So it's very, very dangerous to collect in that area unless one knows very well what one's doing. And that's become a real issue for Chinese culture in general. Whereas that's, of course, not the problem with contemporary art because there are no fakes of living artists.
No, no, absolutely. And Michael, are these trade tariffs imposed by the Trump
Right.
administration, are they going to affect your business?
Yes, I think so. And it's very unfortunate for the art trade in general, because when we sell to our American clientele, we are having to pay, they are having to pay these huge tariffs. And the Chinese tariffs fluctuate from minute to minute, as you know. But I mean, these can be very big. So it's a real issue, and it's very disappointing. I think if they drop down for art to, let's say, 10 or 15%, then I don't think it's going to make a big impact. But if they are up to 50%, then people are going to think twice. Even our clientele, well-heeled clientele, will think twice if it's literally 50% more than the price that they're paying. So I do think it's affecting us, yeah, or will affect us. We'll see. We'll
What, what
see.
about what about museums in China and galleries with permanent collections
Right. Well,
of Chinese modern
right,
or contemporary art?
right. Well,
What are the main ones?
right. Well, there are quite a lot of private museums created
Yes.
by rich Chinese in all over China, and many of them remain empty, but they are sort of prestige monuments. And some of them contain works of art, and some of them contain contemporary works of art. Most of them, when they go for contemporary, they go for Western still. I
Right.
think that's in the process of changing, but the big names of the West had more prestige for the Chinese than the big names, contemporary names of China, interestingly enough. But I think that's in the process of changing.
Right. Okay. And one of the concerns someone here, Agnes, is saying is presumably is the uh, aggressive pressure and surveillance from the Chinese Communist Party tracking what contemporary artists are doing, as
Yes,
you have mentioned.
as I say, I think now it's very, very hard for artists to feel as free as they did 20 or 30 years ago. Xi Jinping is definitely clamping down on the art market, and it's having an effect. Whether this will have an enduring effect or not, I don't know. It depends on the policies in China. But the artists definitely are feeling more subdued now than they were 15 years ago. And I think this is not a very attractive development, and it's concerning to us. However, they still continue to make art and they still continue to sell it, but they have to look over their shoulder to make sure that they're not doing anything which is considered to be provocative by the Chinese government. And many of the things that I've showed you now are not provocative at all, but it's so they don't have to worry. But anything with any hint of a criticism of the government is dangerous.
Yes, Agnes Zhang, with a comment and a question, really. The only publicly owned contemporary art museum in Shanghai is Power Station of
Right.
Art,
Yeah,
and they have a contemporary art collection, but
exactly.
don't apparently show it to the public.
No,
Why is that?
well, I
Is
don't
that
know.
true?
They have shown. I don't know now, but it has been open to the public. But I don't know. I mean, that's the sort of anomalies of what's going on in China, um, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah, yeah. And are you optimistic about the future of the market that you deal in?
Well, Roddy, I'm optimistic about China.
Yeah.
I'm very optimistic about China, whatever their current so-called economic difficulties are, or political difficulties. I think that this is a people who are so gifted and so resourceful and so determined that I don't see, and so intelligent, I don't see that 1.4 billion Chinese are not going to have a massive effect on the world. And in my view, in many ways for good. I mean,
Yes.
look at what they're doing. I mean, in terms of renewable energy, for example, admittedly, they've got the coal mines still going, but they're doing magnificent amount of work in many of these areas, in artificial intelligence, lots of good stuff. Much of it in cooperation with the West as well. But I was reading in the Financial Times this morning that the MIT professor and Harvard, one of his colleagues in Harvard, was saying the supreme challenge for the United States now is the scientific and technological revolution in China.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And Michael, the China's Belt and Road routes that it's
Yeah.
established, have they helped raise awareness of Chinese
No,
contemporary art?
no, it's a good question. I think that whole soft power and all of that, uh, these constructive things in many ways that the Chinese are doing all over the world, in Latin America, etc., Africa. I think that that doesn't seem to impinge on our world, the art world, at all so far. I mean, it's interesting. We have a handful of clients, Roddy, out of 8 billion people. A handful. You only need a handful. You only need
Yeah.
two at auction to drive the prices up out of 8 billion. But it's interesting.
Yes.
In a way, I would have thought there would be a flood of interest in Chinese culture because China is so important to us. Um, but I think that this is a whole other discussion about the art world and what the new generation making money are doing, etc. So it's another discussion entirely.
Yes. Yes. But what should people, for example, in the UK do, people who will grow up dealing with the century of Asia as leaders of businesses, what
Well,
should they be doing to increase their knowledge and understanding of Chinese culture?
right,
Apart
exactly.
from
So
obviously from listening to this talk, what would
but
you?
Roddy, it's interesting. I was reading a couple of days ago. Do you know how many people in students in England are studying Chinese language at A level? 15, just under 1,500,
Yeah, yeah,
1,500 people out of 60 million. 1,500 people. This is disgraceful. It's ridiculous.
yeah.
It's frustrating. And where do you think the Foreign Office is going to get their diplomats? Out of a pool of that 1,500 doing A level, most of them are going to drop it. They then do Chinese if there are a few of them at university. So where are you going to get the diplomats from? The people who understand China, have any idea of China? it's a disaster in this country. But I
Yep.
mean, that's just another element in it. And I don't know, we don't really have a connection with many collectors of Chinese. There are no serious collectors of Chinese contemporary art. Not serious. Here we have people who buy the one or two things, but not committed. You know, I mean, this is a whole other issue. This British lack of enthusiasm for what's going to happen in the world over the next 100 years.
Are there some those significant collections in British museums?
Yes, I mean yes, the British Museum and the V&A and the Ashmolean and many museums have great things, great paintings. Very few of them by contemporary. The Ashmolean Museum at Oxford has done some very good recent exhibitions of contemporary, actually, including Liu Dan. And the British Museum has bought a bit in contemporary as well. So there is things going to give them their due. These great museums in England, there is some movement and some interest. So because you've got great scholars here of Chinese history, and so that is quite promising. It's
Someone is asking about the Museum of Art in Pudong as a place where contemporary Chinese art has been featured, referring in particular to Su Bing's work.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
yep.
Yes, indeed. So quite a lot of the artists that we've just been exhibiting here to you have been exhibited in Chinese museums. Uh, so that has happened and is happening. So there is a momentum in China as well, and I don't want to give you the wrong impression by saying that the art market is so subdued. It is subdued, but yes, things are definitely happening, of course.
Okay, good. I'm going to give you a couple more questions as they are here. I think it's helpful to know this.
There's a
Um,
there's a famous person who's asked a question I see uh,
good.
called Saab Eigner, and he's a
Yes.
great collector of all sorts of things. And I don't want to go
Hmm.
into detail because it's very private. But he asked a question, and I'm sure it was very intelligent, knowing him as I do.
Do you want to read that out if you can see it where you are?
No, I can't see it anymore. It's gone. I'm so
I
sorry.
can see it. Once he writes, once things settle down and China comes out stronger and more engaged with and interacting with the West, hopefully, would you agree that the great early modernist artists, followed by the avant-garde contemporary artists, will come back to the fore? They will be the same as the 1950s, 1960s, and early 70s of the New York artists.
Yes, yes. So the answer to that is an emphatic yes.
Right. Right.
Thank you, Sam.
Good.
I
And
thought
then
you would
another
get
one here from John Davis, I think it is. Can you speak to the influence of contemporary Chinese art on what you describe as the continuing cultural revolution?
Sorry, it sounded like an interesting question. Sorry, could you repeat it?
Can you speak to the influence of contemporary Chinese art on what you describe as the continuing cultural revolution?
Yes, well, I mean, I think that um, I can't go into so much detail. I think Chinese contemporary artists, in whichever area of specialization they are in, ink painting or avant-garde video stuff or sort of representational, they
Yeah.
are having an effect, I think, on what is happening in China at the moment culturally. And it's happening, as I was saying, in all these different areas, in dance
Mm.
and film and video and music and even philosophy is taking on board a whole new self-confident world that the Chinese feel for the first time after the humiliations of the 19th century, that they are making an impact on the next century. They are the coming society. That's what I think the Chinese feel, and the artists feel. And there's a lot of underlying self-confidence in China, which I think is carrying them forward, and quite understandably.
And as we would all observe, Chinese attitudes towards time are quite different from those in the West.
Precisely.
That,
I
yeah,
mean,
and what is it they say? You have the watches, but we have the time. And they can wait a very long time for things to happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's true enough.
Do you have, Michael, just sort of as we begin to draw to a close, because our hour is almost up, do you have any plans that you can share with us for the future exhibitions or
Yes, I do. I
wishes?
mean, I'm interested in. I'm very committed to the field of Chinese contemporary painting, and particular ink painting. What
Yeah,
the authority in the Stanford was saying, this intellectually daring area of Chinese art, and I think these people are making a huge difference to Chinese culture. But Chinese painting in general is an area which we continue to work at seriously and for the future. We're also looking at other areas of Chinese bronze works from the second century, the second Bronze Age of China, from the 11th century to the 17th century. So that's an area that I enjoy very much. It's still undervalued academically and financially. So that's an area. I'm just very interested in. I'm interested in the relationship between Japanese art, Japanese culture, and Chinese culture, and the exchange between them starting in the 12th, 13th century. Fascinating. And I'm interested in buying works in both of those different cultures at that time, and try to see how those works will have an impact on European modernism in the early 20th century. So lots of plans, lots of plans. I hope that I can realize them.
good. Good. Well, I hope you can share those with us. And we are enormously grateful to you for what's been a wonderful trip through the collections that you've had and developments within Chinese art. Someone's already saying, very interesting talk. Many thanks.
Thank you.
This was a fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you
And
so much.
it sort of leads on to what we will be doing at the end of this month, which is a webinar on climate change and water security in Central Asia, which is a huge issue. But
Absolutely.
on behalf of all of those who've been listening and those who will see the recording of this event on YouTube, thank you for opening our minds to the different developments in contemporary Chinese art. Thank you for stressing the importance of our taking time to understand the thinking behind the art that is generated. Graphic arts, like music, transcend language, which is so important and so important in bringing people together. And Michael, on behalf of the Age of Scotland Institute, we can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us this afternoon, your time, this morning, mine, and taking us on this fascinating journey. So thank you so much.
Well, Roddy, thank you very much indeed. As you know, I'm very grateful to you for having me on. And thank you to all of you who took the trouble to get onto this. And I hope we manage to uh, have further exchanges in the future. Thank you all.
Wonderful. We must do it again, and we must get you up to Scotland and not over the
Indeed,
Silbury Tube, as it were, sometime.
indeed,
Good.
indeed, Roddy. Thank you so much, Roddy.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
all.
much.
Bye bye.
Thanks.